trying to talk about sex and trying to treat it as a subject which is worthy of serious critical thinking means also kind of not being cute and sexy all the time, or not having to make a joke all the time, or being careful about where you bring in levity. Because I think sometimes there is space for levity, but we have to make sure that we're not doing that around sex in and of itself, because I also think it just devalues it.
I'm Cindy Darnell. Welcome to The Erotic Philosopher, the podcast where we examine and explore sex and relationships through social, personal, cultural, scientific, political, and other lenses, and unpack and explore your erotic quandaries with the world's wisest erotic philosopher. Today's guest on The Erotic Philosopher is Justin Hancock, a sex and relationships educator, trainer, and practitioner who works with young people and adults and has been doing this work since 1999. His website, bishuk.com, is one of the leading sex and relationships advice websites for people over 14. It receives thousands of visits a day and is highly regarded by young people and practitioners alike. Justin has worked in schools, colleges, universities, and youth projects for over 20 years, delivering relationships and sex education. In addition to this, Justin works with practitioners in sex and relationships education and sexual health services, providing training and resources. He's also the co-author of a sex advice book with Meg-John Barker, Enjoy Sex How, When, and If You Want to. And he hosts the Culture, Sex, Relationships podcast. Justin's latest book, Can We Talk About Consent?, is published by Quarto Books and is available now. Enjoy today's discussion with Justin Hancock.
So, Justin, welcome to The Erotic Philosopher. I'm really glad to have you here. It's been a while since we've been in the same orbit together.
Yeah. I think it was a pub last time we saw each other. Yeah, it's lovely to see you. Yeah.
Quite a few years ago in London.
And Zooms are the new pubs now, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Aren't they? And so our meeting over the years has been through many of our mutual connections, primarily Meg-John Barker, I think, was one of the first people who introduced us. And since then, you've been, busy writing books and hosting podcasts and things. And one of your specialties, which is really the reason I invited you on the show, is your work with young people and sex education. And so many of the guests that I've had here on The Erotic Philosopher have been people working in the adult sector, myself included. And I haven't had a lot of representation from the people who work with young people. So let's start there, Justin. Let's talk about the state of sex education for young people.
I mean, it's dire. I think that probably depends on that's a broad generalization, and it depends on where your listeners are listening from. If you have any Dutch listeners, they'll probably be like, what's this guy talking about? This guy has got literally no idea what he's talking about. They'll be saying, well, this guy must be British.
Right. Context matters, people. Context matters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But certainly, my work is in the UK, and the sex education that I'm most familiar with is in the UK. And sadly, it's still not good enough. We've got state mandated sex ed now, so schools have to deliver it. It's very complex, but we have to deliver it. They have to deliver it, and the guidance has finally been updated. So schools did have some relationships and sex education guidance that was last written in the year of our Lord 2000 AD. And that was updated last year or the year before last. And that updated guidance is rubbish. And it comes
the updates are also rubbish. Wow. Yeah. So you were sitting on a curriculum that was 20 plus years old, and they've updated it and they still botched it.
Yeah. And it's it's still the kinds of things that we've been complaining about for so long. It's all about ramping up the idea of risk and the idea that sex is inherently, difficult or leads to problematic outcomes like sexually transmitted infections and unplanned pregnancies.
So it's still based in those fear narratives.
Exactly, yeah. And so, you know, broadly what happens is young people aren't getting enough sex education in school, but also they are living in a world which outside of the classroom has become more, as we would call, sex positive. And I'm somebody for whom sex positive is neither. For me, actually, sex positivity is more of a negative thing than a positive thing.
Okay, so say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so basically, I think that we have sex negativity, which is the you know, sex is risky, don't do it kind of thing that a lot of us have received.
Bad, sex is scary, sex is painful, sex is
dangerous. That you should only do it in the context of a committed relationship, and that relationship has to be heterosexual and between cisgender folk, and it has to be about penis and vagina sex and reproductive sex. You know, that's all like sex negativity. But then sex positivity is a whole different set of discourses, which are to suggest that, you know, to quote George Michael in I Want Your Sex, and I love George Michael, and I love I Want Your Sex. Sex is natural, sex is fun. Not everybody does it for sex is natural, sex is fun.
Sex is good.
Sex is
not
good.
Everybody
Not everybody does it,
but everybody should.
Exactly. And, you know, you won't find me criticising George Michael on podcasts. However, you know, he was wrong in that one.
I agree. He was wrong in that. Yes.
Yeah, it's a great jam though. So everyone should. There are 3 parts to it, and the third part where he's playing like a seducer and he's trying to get someone drunk. It's like, George, come on, this is bad.
Yeah, very, very bad form. Very, very much of its time.
That's right. That's the 12-inch version, dear listener. So, so young people are at school, they're getting all the sex negativity, but then also they are in broader culture, there is sex positivity, which is to say, yeah, as I was saying, sex is really great, we should do it, and an imperative to do it as well. And also an imperative to get good at it and to learn a set of entrepreneurial skills wherein you find your partner, they're the best sex you've ever had. That's how you keep your partner, and you have to keep getting good at it and, you know, athletic and technically proficient and all that kind of stuff. And with it comes a whole load of other messages around what it is to be sexy and who gets to be sexy and who's allowed to be sexy. And, you know, I know a lot of folk who like the term sex positivity would say, you know, that's not sex positivity, and I don't want to get into like a row with it. But broadly speaking, all it does is to replace one set of problematic discourses with another. And so what sex ed should do, and what I try to do in the sex ed I do, is instead of giving people a set of like good discourses, like these are the kinds of things that you should do, instead I try to get young people to critique the shoulds and to give them instead a set of tools. So a set of tools where they can figure out how to tune into their own sexuality, how to tune into their own relationship to themselves, their relationships to relationships, and more broadly, their relationships to the world. And so giving people tools to do that. So as Foucault would talk about, technologies of the self. And that's what sex education should be doing. It should be getting people to critique all of this, but it doesn't. And there are lots of reasons. We can go into the reasons why, but that's the current state of play. And it's kind of depressing because I've been doing this for since 1999, being a sex educator in the UK. And I basically only kind of see it getting worse, not better.
Wow. I mean, that's really disappointing. So let's have a talk about, you said, you know, I give young people tools, and there are a lot of reasons that they struggle with the critical thinking part of sex. So let's first of all look at the reasons that young people struggle with critical thinking around sex. I would wager actually that it's probably also adults who struggle with critical thinking. It's not just young people. And then I want to sort of dig into some of the tools, some of the, you know, the ways that we can navigate this absence of critical thinking. And I agree with you that school-based sex education, the way it appears to be in the US here as well, in Australia, the UK, and probably a lot of other countries, it is not especially comprehensive, often because, as you say, the curriculum is out of date or out of touch. And then there's not enough support for the teachers who are delivering the sex ed in school, if it's the sports teacher or the health teacher or the science teacher who's maybe, quite religious or hasn't had the training in teaching sex, then they come and, deliver these messages that are, off somehow, or the information in the US, often the information is just blatantly inaccurate, or it's stuff that people just make up. So I agree with you that school-based sex education is not always the way to go. And then there's this absence of critical thinking. So let's talk about where that comes from in relation to sex in particular.
Yeah, it's a really good and big question. I think that we don't take it as a serious subject generally in society. I think that it's, there are two ways to behave to sex in the UK, which is to giggle at it as if you're Sid James in a Carry On film, or to completely ignore it. And I've just learnt over the years and through my work that the best way to do it is just to be as matter of fact as possible and just to treat it as seriously as any other subject, to the point where, young people watching my videos say that, the video is good, but my voice is sending them to sleep. Because trying to talk about sex and trying to treat it as a subject which is worthy of serious critical thinking means also kind of not being cute and sexy all the time, or not having to make a joke all the time, or being careful about where you bring in levity. Because I think sometimes there is space for levity, but we have to make sure that we're not doing that around sex in and of itself, and because I also think it just devalues it. So I think that's this kind of broader thing going on, that the idea that a lot of people in relationships probably kind of experience too, which is that if you have to think about it or employ any tools or do any talking about it, then somehow it's not meant to be, and so that somehow sex is just kind of meant to magically be good with the right person. And I think that is a kind of broader societal issue we have. I think like the prohibitions around talking about sex as well are completely intergenerational. Like they have just been handed down from generation to generation. If you think about the average teacher in school, not only have they not been trained, but also they've not received good sex ed themselves. So if you then imagine who taught them sex ed and imagine who taught them sex ed, so these messages get passed down, but also these messages around sex negativity that I was talking about before are just kind of out there in culture. We see all the time in culture that sex is only meant to be about penis and vagina sex. It's meant to be reproductive. That
everybody has to have an orgasm,
right? It requires men to be active and women to be passive. It requires women and men. It requires tops and bottoms. Or as always requires a kind of an active and a passive participant. And yeah, I mean, those are kind of out there in society too. And so that is either a kind of that's either passed down from Thomas Aquinas, who was talking about logical sex and illogical sex, and we get kind of sinful sex and non-sinful sex, or it's kind of given to us through that's kind of given to us also through like Hollywood and porn and TV and media and the law. And as we see in Gail Rubin's Charm Circle, there are certain sexual activities in certain contexts which are okay. So within the inner Charm Circle, so monogamous, private, non-transactional, in a loving relationship that the acts are procreative, and then everything else outside of that is just not okay. So kink, polyamory, any forms of non-procreative sex, not okay.
So for folks listening who maybe are not familiar with Gail Rubin is an academic who created this model called the Charm Circle, and basically it states that there are certain people who have, let's say, privileges around sex, and they are primarily married heterosexual people who have sex to procreate, and then everybody else who engages in other kinds of sex are those relationship styles and those sex styles are considered less valuable and less important, is the theory that washes into mainstream society about how we talk about sex.
which we still very much have, don't we? Even in 2022, yeah. So, yeah, that's a very long answer to a big question.
But this is the thing about, where we're sort of missing these points and the absence of critical thinking, that even in 2022, we're still spoon-fed these narratives that really could have come out of the 1950s, even though in a lot of places, certainly in the West, let's say, not everywhere, but in the West, there are a lot of places where being gay, being queer is okay now. And we can understand that people have different kinds of attractions and different kinds of interests. But even still, there is this stigma, there is this hesitation, and especially for young people seeking knowledge, seeking information from parents, from community leaders, from, sports coaches and this kind of thing. Adults stumble on how to support young people. So looking at the tools that you were talking about earlier, and also you said, that people, youngsters come to your website looking for the answers that they're not getting in their mainstream sex education. What are those kinds of things? What is it that young people actually really want to know?
Well, the things that so most young people find my website, Bish, from Googling their questions. So, and how they get, so obviously there are complications here around about the Google algorithm and what they're going to serve whom, it's a whole other topic. But the kinds of things that they're searching for are things like how to have sex, where is the clitoris, they also ask, am I pregnant, quite a lot, when they're given scare stories about pre-cum and pregnancy, and they are terrified that they're pregnant for pre-cum and they're not. Also about masturbation and whether it's okay or not. So all those kinds of things that are just not covered. So the stuff to do with sex, the stuff to do with our bodies, and the stuff to do with solo sex are the things that are the most searched for terms. And I get thousands of young people visiting the website every day. So it's like, it's great that I can do that. It's great to have a resource that does that. But also the kinds of questions that they ask me. So there's the ability to ask Bish. And I've just got a few of them here in front of me. So I feel guilty for not sending nudes. Why won't he top me? How do I get over the shame of sharing a nude? When do people begin masturbating? My sex dreams feel better than sex in real life. Is prone masturbation bad? My boyfriend's watching porn and I'm not into it. My friend was forced into sex and I'm worried. So the kinds of things that young people...
Yeah, wow, they're really rich questions, aren't they?
Yeah, but also they're the kinds of things that, like, in inverted commas, adults are worrying about as well.
Absolutely.
So, because my website is for over 14s, it is for young people. It is aimed at young people who are thinking about having sex and relationships for the first time. And so there is a huge amount of overlap between, what a young person thinking about getting into sex and relationships for the first time, thinking about their sexuality in these kinds of ways. There's a lot of overlap between those young people and a lot of adults. And so I think that there is I think that we don't treat the topic seriously enough, but also we don't trust young people enough to be able to go there with them and to turn it into, the equivalent of a GCSE or an A level or, whatever equivalent qualifications there are, that we could teach it in that kind of way. And so this is what I'm determined to do. During the last lockdown here, I did because young people they weren't getting any very much education about sex ed during lockdown. So I did a teach yourself sex ed course, which is up at the website as a 9-part series. And so the kinds of things I'm getting them to think about there are quite complex. I kind of lead them by the hand and say, ask them a question about this, and as if I had students for 9 weeks, which I never get to. And so the first one is all about the sex education they've received so far. So I'm kind of getting them to think about the conversation we've been having so far about sex negativity, sex positivity, the kinds of implicit messages that come along with the messages we receive about sex, who it is we learn about sex from, which were the most valuable things, and so to get them to start critically thinking even about that topic. And so that's just something that we could all be aiming for.
Absolutely. And how do you find their responses being invited to start dissecting, some of these, what I would call like the Disney narratives and the porn narratives, which, as far as I am concerned, intersect and inform so much of how we look at sex and relationships? When people get into a flap and they're like, porn is ruining the kids. And I'm like, well, I think Disney's doing just as equal a job. Not that there's anything wrong with Disney and not that there's anything wrong with porn, but neither of them are supposed to be sex education. They function as entertainment, yet we still default to them as the places we get our sex and relationships education. So inviting youngsters to think critically about, well, where did I learn that sex was supposed to be like this? Where did I learn that I was supposed to do that? How do they respond when the lights come on and they're like, oh, shit, yeah?
Well, sadly, I don't get to do that kind of work very much because, I'm a freelancer and schools have to pay me to go into the schools because schools have got little money and it's a low status subject. But on the occasion where I do, and also when I've trained teachers who then do this work with young people, they say, well, the kids love this. Like, they genuinely love it. They are sick of being lectured. Oh my God, they're sick of being lectured. The one thing that they constantly say is, stop showing us videos, stop lecturing us. Like, they are so bored of it. Over here in the UK, we've got this video called the Tea and Consent video, which is an absolutely dreadful resource. It's
that's been around a while and it's terrible.
Yeah. And young people have seen it and they're not learning anything from it. And in fact, they're learning a lot of problematic things from it, but also even the process of delivering sex education is just as important as the content. And if you don't know a great deal about sex, I don't think that really is as problematic as how you do it. If you're willing to have a conversation and to kind of co-create education, to co-create learning, and you're able to create the conditions where people can be honest and to speak freely and for there to be no shame, but for there to be affirmation and support. That's the really important bit. Like, we can all learn about the efficacy of the IUD, right, by looking it up. Got that at my website. I think it's like 99.4, maybe higher. But, we can all learn about that now. But the thing that you can't get from online and the thing that you can't get from just doing this for yourself necessarily is to have an environment where these things feel okay and for you to actually start practicing using the words and practicing saying things out loud, which, after all, are the kinds of things we need to do if we're having sex in real life with people, is to say things out loud, use our words.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, talking about this notion of context, and I completely agree that context, making an environment where we can speak freely and easily, obviously with trepidation if we've never done it before. So through the lens of, adults who have teen kids or they have teenagers in their life because of their work or whatever it is, do you have any suggestions for these adults on how to create these contexts where young folks can feel, I don't know, is the word empowered? Probably not confident, but certainly feel like they have permission to start asking questions like, why won't my boyfriend top me? Why, these sorts of things. If this is the information that they're looking for, how can the adults in these young people's lives support them better?
I think there are several kind of practical hot tips, really. But the first is to think about your own sex ed and to think about what you were taught and to think about the sources of that and the sources of shame. And to also think about, to realize that the things that you were taught by this sex negative sex education that seems to be passed down in many countries. That why do we have that? Why are we taught that sex is very bad for you and that we shouldn't even really talk about it? And who gains from that? Right. So first of all, remembering that if I'm finding it difficult or awkward to talk about sex, it's because I've been taught this way. Okay. And so an anecdote about this is that I was training some teachers at an international school in mainland Europe, Central Europe, and it was an English-speaking international school. So a lot of the teachers were Brits, Americans, Aussies, and there was one Dutch guy. And so I said to everyone, okay, first activity, I want you to think about your sex education, what that was like. All the Brits, Aussies, Americans were like, it was sex negative. It was don't get pregnant. Getting pregnant is the worst possible thing. Sex is all about reproduction, all the things we've been talking about. And then this Dutch guy put his hand up and said, no, not me. We were just taught, sex is just like this. And, we were like penis, vagina, arms and legs. It's all very matter of fact. It's all very normal. It's fine. Sex can be pleasurable. These are the ways you make it pleasurable. I was like, okay, so this is a really interesting counterpoint. So when we've been taught that sex is these things and we can't talk about it, and we are taught with such shame and stigma, then of course we can't talk about it. But this Dutch guy is demonstration that we just can. The culture is doing this to us. And we make culture and we can just as easily remake it. So that is a really good starting point for your conversations with young people, is to say, well, what's your sex ed been like? And then you could say what your sex ed has been like. And you could say, well, what does this miss out on? And why is this problematic? And what about this? And what do you think about this? And what would have been better? And if you'd have done it, what could we have done? So that's a really good starting point.
One of the things that I think parents and carers can stumble with is feeling like, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't have the right information because my sex education was crappy and I don't know about, blah, 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 or I don't even know what topping is or something like that, because of the shame, the awkwardness, the vulnerability around having to admit as an adult, I don't know the answer to this, or, I don't even know how to address that problem in my own sex life as an adult. How can I support you as a young person? To then go to websites like yours and your books, which we'll talk about in a moment, to get that information, or also to recognize that it's okay as a caregiver to provide sex education for a person younger than you, simply by inviting inquiry and asking questions. You don't have to have all the answers. You can just have a facilitated discussion.
Exactly. And that's the thing to aim for, is for it to be a facilitated discussion. And after all, that is what we aim for when we have sex, right? For it to be facilitated conversation in many ways, So even those skills of, do you want to talk about this, or finding ways to ask those questions, to open up spaces, to create spaces where it's okay, is in and of itself really valuable learning, that this is how we do a consensual facilitated conversation. And you can even be very meta about it and say, look how, we're in a private space. I asked you if this is okay. You've made it feel okay. These are the kinds of things that you need to put in action if you want to have sex with somebody. These are the kinds of things you need to have. And it's like, right. So that's where the process as being as important as the content is. That's a really good example of that. But the other thing you're saying there is really instructive as well. It's that worrying about saying the right thing or the wrong thing. And what that leads to is people picking up on facts and also very narrow discourses and just repeating them and lecturing them. So it then becomes not a conversation. It just becomes somebody who is holding the information. You're holding the source of information, the sexual source of information. Sorry, the source of sexual information. You're holding it and you're distributing it at the person that you're meant to be educating. And actually, all you're doing really is to encourage them to monitor and stigmatize themselves and to discipline themselves by doing that, because you are not giving them the opportunity to actually have a conversation about it. And so we get this a lot in consent education, which is really really useful thing to think about, which is that because people are unsure of what the right thing to say about consent is, they stick to a very narrow legalistic definition. And they start to say things like yes means yes and no means no. And that's what consent is. And you have to get a yes before you do anything, that affirmative consent model that we've been seeing. And, a lot of that is just not helpful. Like, a lot of that doesn't actually help people to have consensual sex. It doesn't actually bring in anything about the body at all. It doesn't bring in embodied autonomy or different forms of communicative consent that might be ongoing. And it doesn't get us to think about, it asks us to think about, consent and sex in the way that we consent to cookies being on our computer on a visitor website. That's not how consent and sex works. And so because of that, the person giving the so-called education there feels like, well, I've said the right thing, I've done the right thing. But the other person at the receiving end was not able to say anything, didn't feel like they learned anything, yet they also now feel like, well, now, so I have to get a yes or a no before every single act of sexual activity. How on earth do I do that? And so they either think, well, that's impossible, I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to forget everything. Or it might just not give them anything useful whatsoever to be able to do anything. So, but that's how a lot of sex ed operates. And that's how a lot of our discourses operate. And so it's well-meaning, but the fear of saying the wrong thing, and also this thing of the adult having to be like the expert, leads to these kinds of outcomes, which then creates more and more problems for people like you and I at the other end as therapists and educators when we're dealing with people who have not been given any useful sex ed at all.
Yeah. And so that's that thing. I think, what I'm really hearing is that the sex ed is less about the content, although the content matters, and more about the approach, inviting people to think differently, and that within itself is the sex education, rather than don't put the penis here, put the thing here. That they'll probably work that out along the way, but it's more about, what do I do when I feel awkward? What do I do when I want to change, move my body or ask about a thing, or, all of that sort of, thinking about Brené Brown's work around vulnerability, taking the risks to be authentic and to say, this isn't working for me. I think even a lot of 50-year-olds have struggled to talk about that kind of stuff. So expecting a 15-year-old to be able to maneuver through that when they are still working out, even how they see themselves, working out their identity, their orientation. This is really complex stuff. And it takes a lifetime to integrate, I think.
Yeah, I think it does. I think in some ways it's going to be as difficult for a 50-year-old as it is for a 15-year-old, but for different reasons, because a 50-year-old will have had a lifetime of their own experiences that may also made their future relationship to their sexuality and relationships difficult too. But I think it's a tricky subject, but it's easier than we might think to actually deliver sex ed. But so long as we do it with the correct intentions and try to, rather than be an expert in sex, to be an expert in conversations, and often that just involves knowing the young people you're working with. The thing that I say to teachers is, you often expect me to come into a classroom of young people who don't know me, and I have to take them from 0 to 60 very, very quickly to get them to trust me to take part in the activities that I've got planned for them around consent and porn or safer sex or whatever, relationships, whatever I'm teaching about. And then leave in 40 minutes and they won't see me again. And then you're expecting that I would do a better job at that than you, who know them, who knows what works for them, and they trust you to be a good teacher, and that they also trust that that you're going to deal with, anything difficult that comes out of it. And so it's this, we should treat it seriously, but not also be scared of it as a topic, because really it is just about, It's about good care work. It's about good teaching practices. It's about good listening practices, rather than, as I say, knowing how to spell gonorrhea, which is probably different in the US.
I don't even know how to spell gonorrhea. And in fact, one of my really good friends in Australia, Dr. Vincent Cornelius, was one of Australia's leading researchers into gonorrhea. And even I remember having a discussion with him several years ago, and even he said that he found it difficult to remember how to spell gonorrhea because it's got so many different spellings. Speaking of spelling, Justin, let's talk about your books, which I'm sure have absolutely no spelling mistakes in them. You've got 2 or 3 books out currently?
2 books. 2 books.
Let's talk about those.
So I wrote a sex advice book for adults with my friend, co-author, Meg-John Barker. That was first published as Enjoy Sex, How, When, and If You Want to, a practical and inclusive guide. And then it got republished into a series. So you can't get that anymore. That's rare now. But it's now called A Practical Guide to Sex. And it's part of their practical guide series that Icon Books do. So it's the same book, but with a different cover. And that's a sex advice book which has no pictures in, apart from one drawing which explains what biopsychosocial means. So,
and that's a book that's pitched at adults, that one.
Yeah. So that really is about getting people to think about their sex ed. That's a huge part of it, but also the relationships themselves and solo sex. Consent's a huge part of that. And we don't give, it's not one of those, it's the anti sex advice book in a way that we don't give blowjob tips, the kind of things that we talk about that make for enjoyable sex, or at least not unenjoyable sex, are the kinds of things we've literally just been talking about. How do you create the environment, the vibes, the circumstances and the context in which good sex might become, and how do we do that? And so consent is a big part of that, but also that is consent. So that's what that book's about. And as you imagine, that is not an international bestseller, but it should be.
I have that book. I have one. It's in its original form from several years ago, and I think it's great. And it is practical and it is useful, and it's not the whole kind of 30 positions in one night, which
wheelbarrow.
It's, I mean, there's nothing wrong with 30 positions in one night, but it doesn't really make for interesting sex. I guess it just makes you tired. Well, that's my.
It gives me a bad back.
Anyway, yeah. So, my knees.
Yeah. Sex injuries are a real thing.
They really are. I used to get a lot more of them as a youngster. I think that's one of the other things about getting older is knowing one's own body and just going, I have limitations. And even though, to many people who know me, and maybe this is for you too, Justin, I am the sex lady in many people's lives, and who are thinking that I'm out having wild, crazy sex every minute of every day. And I really spend a lot of time just hanging out with my dog, thinking about sex, talking about sex, critically analysing and assessing culture, but not necessarily having the wild sex that is expected of, people perhaps like you and I.
Yeah, people don't really like to think about me having sex at all, is from what I can gather from speaking to my friends. They don't like to think about
people they don't like to think about you having sex.
Yeah, which is fine.
Oh, well, I'm thinking about it right now. Is that okay with you? That's reverse consent. That's not what to do. You've got to do that in the other way around. It's all good.
It's all good.
Oh, good. All right. Okay, so that was that book, which has now got the new title of A Practical Guide to Sex. And you've got a consent book, right, which is for younger people, is that right? Or is it for everybody?
Yes, that's for over 14s, and it's illustrated in a way where it is basically aimed for young people. For over 14s, again, like everything at my website, it's called "Can We Talk About Consent?" A book about freedom, choices, and agreement. That's it. And so basically, again, I try to really, make it to I take the oversimplified I take the oversimplified narratives that we have for consent that I was talking about earlier, and I try to complicate it and get young people thinking more critically about it, as well as giving a lot of very practical tools for how they might actually practice it in all aspects of their lives. So, for example, how to navigate watching a film together or watching something on Netflix, how to do greetings, how to do a consensual greeting. And during COVID, that became quite a rich topic. So I wrote the book before COVID, sadly, and it came out in the middle of COVID. So probably not the best time for a consent book to come out. But and then there is a sex chapter where we talk about putting all of this into practice, like Mr. Miyagi style from Karate Kid, painting the fence and waxing the floor, and suddenly you're able to do all of these things during sex as well. And so, but also I try to make it about the possibilities for using consent for transformation as well. So thinking about consent on a societal and structural level, and thinking of these are practices that we just need in all aspects of our lives, right the way through. And that those kinds of acts of care are absolutely necessary in establishing, empowerment and human rights work, and also solidarity. And that those are the things that have been missing. And so we need to think of this at a micro level for ourselves, but also on this much more global level about how we might incorporate some of these kinds of themes of freedom, choices, and agreement in order to change things, because we are all not afforded the same level of agency, the same level or the same amounts of freedoms to choose. That's unfairly distributed in society. So it's very political as well, basically. And that's out now in all over, worldwide. Yeah.
So I'm going to include that information in the show notes for people to be able to access this information easily. And tell us again the name of your website so people can hear you spell it out.
It's called bishuk.com. So bishuk.com. Or if you just Google Bish and then something to do with sex, I'm usually the top hit for that. Or if in the UK, I think I'm still the top hit for how to wank. So I'm quite proud of that.
And so for your buddies who don't want to think about you having sex, and you've got the top the top installment for how to wank. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
The things we can be proud of in our careers.
I'm a little bit proud of that. Yeah.
And so what are you working on currently, Justin? What projects have you got going on this year?
It's I'm kind of sucking it and see, really. I don't really know what I'm doing this year, but I've got my podcast that I do for adults, which is Culture, Sex, Relationships, and I'm using that as a way of learning about theory, and so that's been quite interesting for me, as well as hopefully interesting for my audience. So I've been interviewing a few academics about their work, but I also do kind of advice shows as well, where people send in their questions and I answer them. And I'm going to be doing some more training of practitioners who work with young people around, and also adults around sex and relationships and stuff. And also trying to get funding for Bish. So Bish isn't funded by anyone at the moment, apart from a few patrons of my wonderful patrons on patreon.com/BishUK. So that was sponsored by a major condom manufacturer, but they pulled out. Yes, I remember that.
Oh,
yeah.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Although pulling out is more effective than people think. Well, it is if you do it properly.
I think I did it a few times once upon a time in the olden days.
Yeah, I think it's like they estimate it's like if you pull out regularly over the course of the year, there's a 16% chance of pregnancy, I think. So, which is, not as good as the IUD. But anyway. More about that on my website. Yeah, I don't know why they pulled out. Basically, I think COVID had a lot to do with it. There was a bit of, everything I do is highly political. sex ed is in the middle of like culture wars and several different culture wars, several different battle lines at once. And because my website, all my work is very trans inclusive, I'll try to make it as trans inclusive as possible. That's like an ongoing project. It got attacked a lot by folk who don't like that, trying to be diplomatic.
That's a very strong issue in the UK, I understand, the anti-trans.
Yeah, we're called Turf Island. It's really bad, and obviously it's very bad. It's obviously the most bad for my trans friends and colleagues, and their lives and their rights are a constant source of debate in mainstream publications, including the liberal ones. So, like The Guardian and The Times, absolutely disgraceful. They should all be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. They're on the wrong side of history. And we're going to win. It's just that this is a very difficult moment. So if you're listening in the UK, support gendered intelligence and mermaids, give them your money, and try not to get too down, because we will win. But yeah, so Durex, I don't know. I also don't know how much I can say about it, but certainly that was something that came up.
Well, I hope that the patrons that you do have continue to support you, because I think this is such incredible work. And, this is, even these podcasts are done voluntarily. No one's getting paid here, because so much of this work is just, unfortunately, we are accustomed to just working for not very much. And so when we do make money, it's always appreciated. It's very important to support us.
This just goes back to a point, doesn't it? That it's a low status subject, and yet so many people struggle with it. And it's the thing that people struggle with and want advice about the most. Yet the people doing it, people like you and I, are treated with such low status by society that we can't even, it's a struggle to even do them as jobs. So let's all think about that, dear listeners.
Yes, there's another thing to think about. Justin Hancock, it's been utterly delightful to catch up with you. And for folks listening, please consider heading over to Justin's website, where there's a wealth of information for youngsters and adults alike. I'd love to have you back another time, Justin. And
I'd love that.
I also like to join you on your podcast.
Yeah,
at some point in the future when my book comes out. Until then, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
Learning how to talk about sex with young people is really, it's sort of really simple and straightforward, and then it's also really complicated. And so many adults struggle with how to do this with young people, often because they struggle to do it with themselves. So part of this work, around being better at talking about pleasure with young people is when we can learn how to talk about pleasure ourselves. It makes it easier to talk with young people about it, because certainly the questions and situations that they experience are really not that different to the ones that we experience. And this whole idea that sex ed is just for kids it's really not true. So many of us as adults, as you know, struggle to talk about sex and relationships, and as Justin said, it's often skimmed over, and we laugh about it because it's, it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to have to admit that we don't know stuff, or that it's hard, and even for somebody like me who's been doing this for a long time, it's still hard. And it's just part of life. It's learning how to integrate this, like, learning to eat your vegetables. You just have to learn how to do it. And speaking of things we all have to learn how to do, mismatched libidos is something that a lot of people struggle with. And so I just want to remind you that my book on mismatched libido is coming out pretty soon. It is called Sex When You Don't Feel Like It, The Truth About Mismatched Libido and Rediscovering Desire. It's a guide for lovers, partners, couples, people in relationships experiencing mismatched desire. It's an exploration of both low desire and high desire, how it works, what we need to know, and how to move through it with ease and grace. It's coming out in June. You can pre-order now, if now is before June, and if now for you is after June, you can go and get it. Take a look on my website, cindydarnell.com. That's CyndyDarnell.com. Select the books tab. You'll see all the information there, including some fantastic reviews. Speaking of reviews, I'd love it if you left a review for The Erotic Philosopher while you're on my website. Select the podcast tab. You'll see a link there to rate and review us on iTunes. Your ratings and reviews make this podcast more visible, more accessible to the people who need it all over the world. Your ratings and reviews help us keep the podcast ad-free and bullshit-free, and that really matters to me and probably to you too. Speaking of bullshit-free, if you're seeking support with your sex life, your relationships, and your general well-being, I offer therapy, counseling, and coaching to people all over the world via Zoom. All of that is on my website there under the services tab. You will see it. You can follow me on social media at Cindy_Darnell. That's CYNDI_DARNELL. You can also follow The Erotic Philosopher on Instagram and Twitter at The Erotic Philos. That's PHILOS. On my website, subscribe to my newsletter to keep in touch. You can also see my suite of online classes there, pre-recorded, ready to go for you to download and use at home starting from today. There is something there for everybody. And of course, as always, your pleasure is top of mind. Hey, thanks for listening to this fantastic episode with Justin Hancock. And I hope you and the young people in your life are feeling a little bit more confident about learning how to navigate sex and relationships. And until the next time we are together and I'm in your ears, take care of yourselves, and thanks for listening.